Egypt was a kingdom in 1945 led by King Farouk I, when then Foreign Minister Abdelhamid Badawi Pasha signed the UN Charter on behalf of his country in San Francisco. 3 other African countries, Liberia, South Africa and Ethiopia, were also present on that historic day. They were all supposed to be free and independent, yet these terms often rang hollow.
It was celebrated in Egypt as more of a political event rather than a public celebration because of the low rate of education and public awareness at the time. The 4 African countries had what you can call semi-independence. Ethiopia was under the influence of Italy. Egypt was bound by the 1936 treaty with colonialist Britain. South Africa was an apartheid state, while Liberia was connected to France as part of the Francophone.
In the years after the war, Africa rose up. Egypt's leader Gamal Abdel Nasser was often credited with giving dozens of countries across the continent the confidence to push for independence in the 1950s and 60s. Historians believe the UN Charter also encouraged them to seek freedom from colonial rule. Yet on the other hand, many also feel it's let them down terribly since then.
The Charter and the UN community has allowed decolonialization. The Charter has allowed certain support to African independence, but at the same time, injustice in terms of economic relations and unfair trade practices have costed Africa 1.3 trillion annually paid to the others, I mean the West. The African, for example, are subject to the suffering of climate change while they only consume or introduce 3% of world emissions.
Another sticking point in the Charter, which was roundly criticized by Egypt in 1945, was the veto power allotted to only 5 permanent countries at the Security Council, deemed as unfair to the rest of the world.
In spite of its rejection, Egypt didn't have the capacity to change the charter. The charter was offered as one unit, either take it or leave it. There was no flexibility from superpowers, and therefore we had to sign.
However, 80 years on, with these veto powers crippling decision-making at the top, most UN member states are calling for the same reforms. And Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has reiterated the same concerns as his predecessors in this year's Charter anniversary speech.
Egypt believes there is no alternative than to develop and reform the UN to be able to keep up with global challenges. We appreciate the efforts by the Secretary General to develop the UN, yet we still insist that these reforms should allow the UN to play a more effective role in achieving peace.
The veto power is not really going to create a just and peaceful community. One has to recall today's Russia veto in the Ukrainian file and the American veto in the Israeli-Palestinian file.
However, some are still concerned that reform efforts will hit a roadblock.
There was a reform program by former Secretary General Kofi Annan to allow Africans permanent seats in the UN Security Council, but it was foiled by superpowers. Ironically, to amend the Charter, you need a consensus of the Permanent Security Council members themselves. So obviously, we don't expect any success in the near future.
But as the top Egyptian officials said, it's now high time for African countries to occupy their position on the Security Council, to balance, to express, and to protect their interests amongst nations. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo, Egypt.